Welcome, and we are so glad that you're here for another mental health and wellness chat. I am Brittany, and I am here with
Madison,
and we are two of your VC Counseling Center counselors.
an associate.
We're here to have a real conversations about the emotional challenges that students face and discuss, some different strategies for navigating them. Today, we are diving into the anxiety spiral, this overwhelming cycle that happens when worries feed on themselves and make everything feel even harder. Whether it's before exams, social events, or even just daily stressors, anxiety can take over in ways that can sometimes feel totally impossible to control. So today, we're going to have a discussion between me and Madison. We're going to explore how to recognize this spiral, talk about different ways of interrupting it, maybe ideally find some type of calmer ground through this process. And I think this is such a relatable topic. Everyone has anxiety. Yes,
sure.
Even counselors
Oh, yeah.
have anxiety. I think that's probably the most common issue that we all share together, even in like grad school for counseling, is that everyone in that program also struggles with differing degrees of anxiety too.
Definitely.
So let's start simple. When we say anxiety spiral, you might be asking yourself, well, what does that really mean? So thoughts, how would you define the anxiety spiral? What does that mean?
So when I think of anxiety spiral, I typically think of some kind of triggering situation we start with that then contributes to a variety of thoughts that are usually pretty excessive and can be debilitating. That can then turn into maybe we're experiencing physical sensations, combined with those thoughts. And then for me personally, I have these negative thoughts, I have these physical sensations, and I start looking into the physical sensations too deep.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, okay, what's wrong with me? Am I sick? Do I need to go to a doctor? It's just this big cascade of my thoughts and my physical sensations, my feelings all coming together to make my anxiety and worry even stronger and stronger.
Yeah. And even adding on to that, when I think about explaining what anxiety feels like to someone who maybe doesn't know what anxiety is, and I know you might be thinking, how could someone not know what anxiety is? You'd be surprised how often people either don't understand or haven't had it explained in a way where it really actually makes sense. So, if I tell you right now, the sky is blue, you probably don't feel anything about that, right? You're just like, yes, that's a fact, and you move on with your day. But the thing about anxiety is that you have a thought and it leads to an overwhelming feeling of anxiety. So if I were to tell you you're going to die one day, I think most people feel a little bit of anxiety when I say that, because that's a scary thing. Even though it's a fact, just like the sky is blue, it has an emotion attached to it for a lot of people.
Yes.
So anxiety is that emotion that attaches to a thought. And then that leads to symptoms, which if I think about things that make me anxious enough, my heart starts racing, I start sweating, I feel palpitations in my chest. Yeah, exactly. And then that can lead to further thoughts. And so this is the anxiety spiral, basically, is it's one thing to just think an anxious thought, but an anxiety spiral is when, like I said, it spirals, right?
Yep. Going down the rabbit hole.
Yes, so deep down the anxiety rabbit hole. Oh, so okay, each of us we assigned ourselves, even as therapists, we assign ourselves assignments. We assigned ourselves to come up with a good, relatable example for this episode to kind of use as springboards for examples here. So each of us brought an example here today, and I liked it because somehow we magically made these like two separate things, right? Like yours is more physical, mine is more cognitive or thought based.
Yeah.
So Madison, I'll let you go first. Give us your example of a spiral moment that you have experienced at some point in your life.
Okay. I want to preface this by acknowledging something positive about the spiral, because anxiety spirals can be very overwhelming. This is the spiral that eventually made me have the decision and realization that I wanted to be a counselor.
Nice.
So just wanted to acknowledge that, get some, positive from this very difficult situation at the time. But now I can look back at it and say, hey, something great came out of it. Yeah. So anyway, one day I was getting my basics here at VC, and I just happened to be in my 8 a.m. class. And I got this really overwhelming sensation in my chest. I've never felt anything like this. Additionally, I felt this pain kind of radiating down my arm.
Yeah. That already sounds scary.
It was extremely scary. I'm like, okay, what is going on? I've never felt like this in my life. So you can see how thoughts start forming once I have this chest pain, this arm pain. My mind jumps to, I feel like I've heard somewhere that if your chest starts hurting and your arm starts hurting, you're having a heart attack.
Yeah.
So I'm catastrophizing at this point. I'm like, oh my God, am I having a heart attack in the middle of class at like 8 a.m? This is not ideal.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I think that's an understatement saying it's
not ideal at all. So, I had thoughts of what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
I was using Dr. Google a lot, which is never helpful in anxiety spirals. So it was just this cycle of the physical sensations relating to the thoughts. I was in denial that it could have been mental health related.
Yeah.
But eventually that's what it was. It was anxiety. Haha.
Well, and I think that's the thing about the physical aspects of anxiety is that it's such a hard thing because, like, yes, it could very well be a genuine medical emergency or condition,
for sure.
or it could just be anxiety. And it's so black and white in that way that, like, it's good that you got checked out.
Oh, yeah.
And I would definitely recommend everyone go, if you're experiencing symptoms like that, go get checked out by a medical doctor. And if they rule mental health,
rule it out,
then
yes, because it is possible. Because, ideally I was, in my early 20s, so it's not very realistic that it could have been like a medical relation to it, but you never know, right? Crazy things happen. So ruling that out was a huge step for me, and I'd definitely recommend anyone to do that if they are experiencing chest pain. Sure. So that's kind of my example. It really took over my life for a while.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Well, and so I'll say my anxiety is way less catastrophic, or my spiral example, way less catastrophic than that was an epic story. Mine is more mundane, and I wanted to get something that was very relatable that I feel like as people, most of us have done this, and mine is being plagued by that level of social anxiety where you're overthinking social interactions. So taking an interaction, and picking apart the words that you said. A great thing that I think about is, we all have those running jokes where we're like, I said this thing and they probably took it negatively, and I'm going to pick apart what I said and I'm going to think about it 5 years from now. It's going to keep me up. And that's what I'm going to be thinking about at 2 a.m. in bed. Yeah. Those are my example. There are billions of them. Don't worry. Because I have a very awesome habit of this particular trait of overthinking social interactions way more than people who also participate in the same interaction are probably thinking about it. So I'll use that as my example, is just overthinking social interactions. And like I said, we're going to ground in these, and we're going to continuously come back to these throughout this discussion to bring these examples back to kind of demonstrate what we're talking about. So hopefully it makes a little bit more sense and it flows a little bit better for you guys to be able to, really identify with the things that we're talking about. So, and this is the thing, is that like those anxiety spirals, it feeds on itself. The anxiety feeds on the anxiety itself. So what really is even going on in our brains when this happens? Is this me overthinking anxiety? No, definitely not. But I mean, what goes on in our brains? What goes on in our brains? What do you think?
Yeah. So whenever I think about this, I know that our brain hates uncertainty and it hates not having a clear answer. So overthinking is essentially our brain's way of trying to problem solve, trying to control the situation at hand. Our brain thinks, oh, the more I think about this, the harder I think about it, the more I'm going to be prepared for however this plays out, or I'm going to find a solution much easier. But realistically, that's not the case. I wish it was, but it usually just contributes to us mentally exhausting ourselves. And of course, our brain's thinking if we think harder and harder, longer and longer, it's going to give us the solution. So that's why that spiral keeps running around and around and around. But we end up just paralyzed almost by how over analyzing we are of the situation.
And I agree. I feel like everything comes back to control at the end of the day, especially with anxiety, because it's about, I don't know about you, but I only feel anxious about things that I have no control over. Like the fact that I'm going to die, that gives me anxiety because I have no control over that fact. No matter how healthy I live, no matter what I do, the fact is I'm going to die. Same thing with, anything in life. If I feel like I have control and it's taken care of, I'm not going to feel anxious about it.
Exactly.
So I love that point. It does. It all comes back to control. And then same thing too. We know that within our body, whenever anxiety, the biggest part of anxiety is fight or flight response activation, right? So when that activates and engages, all of these physical symptoms are a natural, logical process of that. So it's almost like clockwork. It's like a machine, basically. Your body feels the anxiety is triggered, and it leads to the physical symptoms of anxiety, because by definition, that is what anxiety is. Loop. Um, no, and I love that. I keep coming back to that control, because I think that was so insightful. Of like, it all comes back to control at the end of the day, or at least the illusion of control.
Yes, for sure. So another kind of thing to ponder and just think about is, how do our thoughts, feelings, and our physical sensations play off each other in an anxiety spiral?
Yeah, and I feel like, kind of going back into what we've already said, right? That,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you know, sometimes, yes, you can only have the physical symptoms of anxiety and never really have anxious thoughts. I have seen that happen a few times. It's not super common, but it does happen, where you just kind of get this heart rate increases, you get the sweaty palms, you get the panic, but you don't necessarily have a thought. You're not
Yeah.
like, I'm not thinking about anything. I just feel this particular
Yeah. Or
thing.
there's not anything actively happening in that
Yeah.
moment. Yeah.
That was me yesterday. Whenever I text, and we'll get there. We'll get to the story about of my yesterday. But yeah, that was my yesterday, though. Was, why am I so overwhelmed? Why am I so anxious? Why is today so difficult for me? And
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find an identifiable reason or trigger for why. Yes, there were things that happened throughout the day that I could point to and say, like, maybe it's that, maybe it's that. But ultimately, none of those things were in proportion to the level of anxiety that I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we'll come to this here in a little bit too, of kind of how other factors can tie into that too. So, hang tight with us on that point in general. But so, and I mean, this comes back to a really interesting question of, does there have to be a trigger moment to kick this spiral off, where it's just like trigger, immediate spiral? Or is it something that builds up more slowly over time? Or can both of those things be true?
I think both can be true. I think an example of it kicking off in a spiral is, maybe you get a text message that a loved one's been in a car accident,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
maybe like you get broken up over text. Like, okay, I can see how that instantaneous
Hmm.
moment can lead to an anxiety spiral.
Yeah.
But it can also build up. Like you said, there can be factors that we can pinpoint looking back in our day, like, okay, maybe this contributed to my anxiety, but it doesn't hit us until later
Yeah.
in the day.
Hmm.
I'm not sure, you could probably provide a better example of how it builds up.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree too, because it can be a sudden thing, like you said. I mean, we come back, I think it was a different episode, we talked about the three dots in a text message,
Mm-hmm.
like that sudden, instantaneous moment where all of a sudden we're spiraling in that
Yes.
moment, versus slowly throughout the day, you can kind of feel your anxiety building and building and building and getting
Mm-hmm.
more and more intense over time. Whether there's an identifiable trigger or not, or just a bunch of very small triggers too, both of those are absolutely acceptable. So, how another really great question is how we can help understand and recognize when the spiral is starting, because like Madison said, sometimes triggers just happen and we
Mm-hmm.
immediately recognize we're in that spiral. But what about the more subtle times, where it's slowly building up over time and we're slowly recognizing? How can we even go about recognizing that this is happening before we're in a full-blown spiral, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be helpful to just think about our general triggers for anxiety. And I think if we can become aware of those, we can kind of start to prepare ourselves for whenever we have these situations coming up. We might be able to be more in tune with the fact that, okay, we might start to get a
Mhm.
little anxious here. Is there anything I can do to kind of help calm myself down before things get all the way up to level 10?
Yeah. And for me, I feel like it's important to recognize too, though, that I a lot of times will recognize the physical symptoms of anxiety for me before I even notice what's going on in my head,
Yes.
because there's, 8 billion thoughts in my head at any given moment. And also like background elevator music and the whole king and caboodle. But so I feel like I notice the physical symptoms, be it the teeth clenching,
Mhm.
be it the increase in heart rate, or even if I notice that I'm kind of jittery. That was me yesterday for sure, was the jitteriness, which aligns with our theory that we'll get to. But there's a lot of jitteriness.
Mhm.
And, even whenever I start overthinking social interactions, bringing this back to the original example, that I typically notice that I have a lot of negative thoughts. And I start noticing the content of my thoughts. So noticing that there is like a negative theme playing way more frequently than usual. Like it's not the usual thoughts, very negative thoughts coming through, that my thoughts are using you. The statements start with you. You aren't good enough. Other people don't like you, whatever it might be. So that can be, I circle back around to your point, but that can be another one, is noticing your thoughts and noticing that they have a very negative tone to them. For me, signals anxiety in my body too.
Yeah, just, recognizing your own personal warning signs. I'm pretty sure we've talked about this in other videos. So there has definitely been some times where I've been surprised by what causes my own anxiety spiral. I think, like we mentioned earlier, there's definitely times when I'm at home, I'm chilling on the couch, and I start to get this physical sensation.
Yeah.
And it's like, why am I feeling this way right now? I am watching TV. I'm not doing anything strenuous or
Not being
anything that
chased by
would
a lion.
exactly.
Yeah.
There's no active danger going on, but yet I still feel off. And I think that's really surprising, because like we're talking about, there usually is some kind of trigger or something that it builds up, but sometimes it does kind of feel like it comes out of the blue, and
Yeah.
it's hard to find that explanation for it in the moment. But whenever we look back, we're like, oh yeah, I just did eat like a sugary,
Yeah.
food. I had a
Yeah.
cookie, or my
Hindsight.
blood sugar is spiking, so
Yeah.
there's usually a reason, but
Mhm.
sometimes in the moment we can't pinpoint it.
And there is. Hindsight is always 2020. And I do it a lot. I notice I do it most frequently whenever I'm already overwhelmed. There's already a lot of things on my plate. So it's like, there's a lot going on at work, and there's a lot going on at home, and there's a lot of things that I need to get done in the future that's approaching quickly. That for me, I know that's a really big anxiety trigger, that I'm more likely to find myself in patterns of anxious thinking. And bringing that back, I mean, that these are just patterns of thinking at the end of the day. A big part of treatment therapy, reflecting on this, is recognizing the patterns and then trying to choose alternative behaviors, thoughts, or actions outside of my typical pattern. So before we can do any of that, you have to know your pattern, which, no one can do for you. You have to, put in that work, pay attention,
For sure.
question yourself, look into yourself, ask questions, and do things, to kind of put in that self work. Absolutely. And so, coming back to the example that we keep circling around. So yesterday, I'll tell the story. Yesterday, I had, like I said, a very anxious day. And I got home and I did my daily home routine, which typically helps me unwind and disconnect from work and kind of compartmentalize and shift into home me. And the whole time I was still peak anxiety, right? Almost feeling, borderline panic attack coming on. And I'm sitting there, what is going on? And I kept telling my husband, I am 10 out of 10 anxiety. And he's like, well, what's going on? Let's talk about it. And I'm like, there is no identifiable thing.
Yeah.
I just feel so much anxiety right now.
Mhm.
It was driving me crazy. So frustrating, exhausting. Had all the physical symptoms, shaky hands. And I'm sitting there just like racking my brain trying to figure out, how can I regulate right now? Used all my usual coping skills. Nothing was helping. Getting so frustrated, right? And this brings us to our first point, is that there are some common anxiety triggers that most people don't realize.
Oh yeah.
And caffeine and stimulants in excess. So as I'm sitting
Mhm.
there, me and him are having this conversation. I tell him that I would really like some chocolate, because we all know chocolate fixes everything,
It
right?
does.
And so I tell him, can you please chocolate? Chocolate would help right now, at least 10 points in anxiety, right? And of course, we don't have chocolate. So him being the saint that he is like, well, I can make you coffee. Like, that's basically the same thing as chocolate, which, sidebar, no, it is not. Not anywhere close. Not even whenever I need it that bad, but sure. He's like, I can make you coffee. And my exact words to him were, oh, absolutely not. Are you kidding me? It's, 10 o'clock at night. I've already had 2 cups of coffee
Oh.
today and a full-size Red Bull. I
Hmm.
don't want coffee. And that's when it clicked. And I texted Madison and I was like, you know what? I'm the problem. It's me, because because just yesterday we were going through this script and, kind of preparing for this episode. And we touched on this caffeine, and we were both like, yeah, we really need to make sure that we go over that, because that's such a silent creep,
Oh yeah,
creep within
definitely.
this, is so many people don't even, once we do an inventory, they're intaking 1,000 milligrams of caffeine a day. Like,
Mhm.
anyone would feel anxious if you were
Yes.
drinking 3 energy drinks a day. As I was drinking a cup of coffee, having this conversation,
Mhm.
third cup of coffee that day. So learn from my mistakes, but we're all human.
Light bulb
And
moment.
exactly, yes, we're all human.
Oh.
And yes, even counselors are human. So yes, caffeine, stimulants in excess can
Oh, yeah.
absolutely activate similar pathways in your nervous system and
Mhm.
mimic the symptoms of anxiety. And then today I have had one Red Bull
Mhm.
and no other caffeine, and I am far less anxious than I was yesterday. So that
Huge
was definitely the
difference.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I've found myself wanting to drink coffee. Like, I love the smell of coffee. I love the taste of coffee, but it makes me anxious.
Yeah.
So I can only drink it every now and then. I've had to kind of make adjustments on what I use for caffeine because if I drink a coffee, I'm going to be feeling like an anxious wreck all day. And I don't
Yeah.
want that. I want energy, but I don't want it at the cost of feeling miserable all
At the
day.
cost of anxiety.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it definitely makes sense.
And same thing too, even not getting enough sleep. I know these are super basic things, but when we take all of these together, if I'm intaking a lot of caffeine because I'm not sleeping and I'm also using social media excessively and paying way too much attention to the news and getting, overwhelmed. There's a lot of uncertainty in my life. If I'm dehydrated, I haven't
Mhm.
eaten. I mean, I'm describing a typical Tuesday for most of us, but ultimately these things build up. These things add up over time, and
They
it can
do.
lead to us being more prone to the symptoms of anxiety. And these are things that are totally fixable and
Oh, yeah.
workable with
Very adjustable.
like super simple steps that we can implement to kind of prevent some of this. So, yeah, no, rumination as well. So, rumination is when you think about something over and over and over and over and over, and you can't get it out of your brain. You just keep picking it apart and picking it apart. That definitely leads, and I mean, probably is the spearhead of most anxiety spirals that are cognitive, at least.
For sure.
Can you think of any others, Madison, that I missed?
Um, hmm. I kind of thought of for me personally, there's been times whenever I would be drinking an alcoholic beverage
Yeah.
and I found myself getting anxious from that. And
Yeah.
like you said, a stimulant, but alcohol is a depressant. So it's
That is
supposed to
a
kind of calm us down.
averse
And
reaction. Yeah.
yeah. And so I was like, this is supposed to be making me feel less, socially anxious, but yet I'm feeling more. So that's a big one.
Yeah.
Did you mention like food and our diet, like processed foods, sugary
I did
foods?
not mention
That
diets.
can
Yeah.
definitely, cause our anxiety to spike as well. So another good thing to reflect on is the difference between coping with anxiety versus avoiding it. What are your thoughts whenever it comes to this question?
I mean, I feel like I've gotten into this debate with students or clients before, right? Of how many coping skills are avoidance based at their core,
Yeah.
right? So, like telling people, like a worry timeout is a good one, right? Which is where you put off your worries until the end of the day. So you make an appointment with yourself to say, okay, I'm going to worry at 8 p.m. today. And whenever I have a worry throughout the day, I'm going to make note of it and I'm going to save it for later. And then at 8 p.m., you sit down and you're supposed to worry at 8 p.m. And the theory behind it is that by the time that you get to 8 p.m. and you're trying to force yourself to worry, you can't, but you've like naturally suppressed your worry all day long. So it's like paradoxical in that way. And I mean, you could argue that is avoidance because we're not addressing the worries, we're not changing them, we're not doing something with them, we're just kind of putting them off. And we could argue that how is that not avoiding worrying then? But I feel like it's hard because a lot of times the biggest complaint with worry is that it's persistent by nature. Like the problem with worry is that I can't stop doing it, even though I tell myself to stop. It just keeps happening anyway, and I have no control over worry. So, I mean, that's the real question is like, what is there a difference? Can you even avoid a worry? And is there a difference between coping with it and avoiding it?
Yeah, because whenever we think of avoidance, we know that it gives us that temporary feeling of comfort but at the end of the day, whenever we're faced with that, whatever that anxiety is, that anxiety just continues to grow stronger and stronger. It's a cycle. We know about the cycle of avoidance. And, I think of sometimes distraction techniques. We say like, oh, go, take a walk or go watch a show. And, it does give us that break from that anxiety. But yeah, is it really coping with it?
Well, and okay, so maybe that's the difference is that it's kind of like when we talk about grief, right? Like it's okay to compartmentalize. It's okay to take it, put it in a box, put it on the shelf, walk away from it, get some space, come back, look at it, maybe with fresh eyes now. But I think the thing is that you come back and you look at it again.
Yes.
I think that's the difference.
Once you've calmed down a little bit and you've
Yeah.
had a moment to process. Yeah.
Because if we're avoiding, we're never coming back to it. We're leaving it
Yes.
on the shelf to gather cobwebs. But when we're coping, sometimes we do need to take a break from things in order to effectively cope. But we come back to it at the end of the day. We don't just throw it out the window and, be like, good luck. We'll get back to this later.
Yeah. And those moments whenever anxiety feels so intense, that distraction, that avoidance that we're talking about can be really helpful. And then, like you said, we can circle back to it once we're in a calmer place and can actually be productive with managing it.
So on that note, while we're getting to a calmer place, I think is the logical next step here of how is it that we go about getting to a calmer place whenever we're in the midst of this anxiety spiral.
After an anxiety spiral, it can be helpful to reflect and kind of come back to what just happened, honestly, kind of break it down. It can be helpful to write about it. Whenever we're able to regulate, we can maybe see things more realistically and objectively, rather whenever we're in this kind of fight or flight state of mind where we're not thinking clearly, we can't make decisions very well. So, I think writing it out is a really good way to kind of reflect on it. It allows you to find those patterns. Maybe this has happened before. Reflect on how you reacted, how you want to react next time. What can we learn from this experience to be better prepared next time?
Yeah, just one cup of coffee or one Red Bull, not all of them together, because there's a tipping point where too much caffeine is not going to wake you up anymore. Now you're going to be, anxious. And no, I agree with what you're saying, because really, whenever we're in that anxiety spiral, fight or flight is activated, the part of your brain that thinks rationally turns off. So we're not able to make those rational thoughts and decisions and think things through. And a lot of times we just move on with life and not pretend like it didn't happen, but we just kind of move forward. That's what we do as humans. We continuously push forward, right? So sometimes taking a minute to pause and reflect and ask yourself, like Madison said, let me journal about this. What just happened? Can I identify a trigger? Can I identify a reasonable reason why this could have occurred for me? Or even identify things that may have made the spiral worse or facilitated more anxiety. When I was already anxious and having, a bad day, was I drinking an excessive amount of caffeine? So just kind of seeing, it can help us learn, what coping works for us and what coping doesn't work for us. Because, we say it all the time, but coping skills are coping skills. As therapists, we learn hundreds of them because only a handful of them are really going to click with you, and that's okay. And what clicks with you might not click with the next person, and that's normal. And everyone's brain is different. And, it's a process of finding what works for you, uniquely you, at the end of the day. And it's also important to note, these spirals can be reframed into growth moments and growth periods too.
Absolutely.
And I think a big part of that is what you do with it afterwards. I could be beating myself up about yesterday or about the fact that I have a tendency to overthink social interactions, or I can use it as a growth moment and reframe. Now I know caffeine may not be my friend, and I do this every few months. I have to learn the same lesson 1,000 times before I learn it. I'm that person. But same thing with, social interactions, how rather than getting hung up and tearing myself down that I have this tendency, pause, recognize it, and say, okay, so how could we navigate social interactions in a way that I feel like I'm present and I'm engaged and I am interacting with people in a way that aligns with my values? You know what I mean?
Definitely using it all as a learning experience. And just like you said, yesterday you had too much caffeine. Today you've already made the adjustment of having less.
Yes.
So, this doesn't have to be something that, like you said, we beat ourselves up over.
Yeah.
We can help ourselves find the patterns, use these as experiments, ultimately to help ourselves.
I haven't even finished this Red Bull. You hear that?
Wow.
Jingling, there's still Red Bull on the bottom of it, and it's 3:30. So I'm doing pretty good so far. But okay, so another thing that I wanted to make sure that we talked about in the midst of this is from an outside perspective looking in. Maybe you're a partner, spouse, friend of someone who struggles with this, and you're listening to this video because you're trying to figure out what they're going through and how you could support them. So let's talk a little bit about that. Yeah. How could friends, partners, whoever, be helpful to someone when they see this happening and not necessarily make it worse? What are some helpful things that they could do, maybe?
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking back to your example of how your husband kind of asked, hey, let's talk about this, because talking it out with someone who is not actively going through the same anxiety that we are, they can kind of help us see more clearly, help us problem solve whatever's going on. So I think that could be really beneficial. And sometimes if you might not want to talk it out, maybe it's giving that person their space if that would be helpful for them. And then just also having, empathy for your partner who's going through it. Like, hey, I can recognize that you're going through a really hard time right now.
Yeah.
And whenever you are ready to work through this and talk about this, I'm here for you.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I add to that too is asking what they need directly, saying, what do you need right now?
For sure.
Because then we want to set ourselves up for success. So rather than trying to guess what they need, rather than trying to guess what they want, rather than fumbling and, working ourselves up, just directly ask, hey, what do you need from me right now? And you might be surprised by the answer. They might just say, I just need you to hold me and tell me everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
So simple. Anyone can do. We can do that. And it very well may make a difference. So yeah. And, even if, like Madison said, empathy, even if you've never been through what they're experiencing, or even if you've never had anxiety to a high degree, just respecting the fact that they do and that this is hard for them, and communicating openly, maybe once they calm down, especially in more depth, and, even kind of doing these debriefings with them if they're open to it of, hey, what was going on? Let's, do you want to talk that through with me, and kind of helping them understand you don't have to have an answer. No one has the answers, but you're helping them find their answers, I guess, is really the goal at the end of the day.
Yeah. Another thing I thought of is you can even kind of educate yourself about anxiety if you're unfamiliar with it. You never experienced it yourself. And this video can be a great way to do that. Just learning more about what they're going through can help you build up that empathy and have those conversations with them. So,
for sure. There's so much on social media, pop culture about anxiety, so much education these days, so many, even, light parody videos, just being empathetic and understanding of kind of what this experience is like. And on that note, throwing my husband, we pulled him out from another bus. We're going to throw him back under the bus again. Some things that do not help. And I warned him, don't worry, that I would be throwing him under the bus in this episode. Actually, last night while we were talking about my anxiety, just stop worrying. That's his favorite response. And I always give him such a hard time when he does it. He's like, there's no reason to worry about that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're right. I'm cured. Like, you're right. You're so right. But no, I roast him, but he's so sweet. But no, I mean, and the problem with these kind of statements is that it feels minimizing, I guess, at least for me. Like, it feels like you're saying, well, there's no reason that you should feel that way. When for me, like, there is a reason that I feel this way, or else I wouldn't feel this way, even though I know objectively it is true. Objectively, I know I should not worry about things. However, I'm still going to. Yes, and that's okay. Same thing, along the same lines, like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I get the perspective of, like, you're trying to rationalize, you're trying to ground, you're trying to make it make sense. Right. But ultimately, sometimes with certain people, this can be frustrating or minimizing, or, people shut down, and, everyone has their response, but ultimately, something as simple as how can I help can be a more constructive way to ask a question or respond in these moments sometimes.
Yeah, because it's not a big deal to you, but to me, it feels huge right now. Another one I love is calm down.
Just calm down.
No one in the history of being told that has ever calmed down. I don't think so. Oh my gosh. Like don't you think I would if I could?
Yeah.
Or, another one, you're being too emotional.
Yeah.
I'm aware. You don't have to point it out.
Yeah,
let me have my moment.
That's like a whole separate episode discussion for that one.
Teaser.
And I think so. And this brings us to a really good question, though. Like, does anxiety always need to be managed, or can it sometimes be a messenger or a guide in some sense? Because I feel like sometimes it absolutely can inform me about my world. Like, if every time that I'm around you, your behaviors, your presence gives me an overwhelming sense of anxiety, I might argue, like, let's reflect on this friendship. Like, you know what I mean? Like, how is this, why is this impacting me so negatively,
Oh yeah. I mean, anxiety, all emotions in general, I think we like to view them as messengers, as signals we need to tune into to help us figure out, like you've been saying, what do I need? What is going on? Is there a change I need to make? So they're huge for telling us maybe what our next step needs to be.
Well, and I love that reframe that you say too, because I mean, emotions, anxiety, it's all one type of message about the world that we're going through.
Yeah.
Yes, they can be inaccurate, they can be, off the wall, but sometimes they can be so accurate and so helpful and so informative. Because
Definitely.
like in the example I gave, if a thing, person, place repeatedly in what's the word that I'm looking for? Like creates, like, you know what I mean? Like if repeatedly like initiates the same emotional response every time and it's negative and I don't like feeling that way, then the challenge is like, okay, well, what is it about this? Why do I keep putting myself around this person, place, thing, trigger, whatever it is? So it can definitely be helpful information. Sometimes logically we want to do stuff, but emotionally it might not be the healthiest thing for us.
For sure.
For sure. So okay, last point for reflection here, because this is getting a little bit long, is that, so what does it mean then? Because this is kind of where we're going with all of this, right? Is how do we have a healthier relationship with anxiety as a whole? And I mean, maybe even bringing it back to your example in the beginning of, I'm gonna put you on the spotlight. Of like how, bringing it back to your original example, how can or have you found a healthier relationship with anxiety given those experiences?
Yeah, for sure. So I think now, knowing what I know now, going through that experience, it's helped me to be more kind of patient and understanding with myself and my body and the reactions that it has. Whenever I do feel those physical sensations coming up, I remind myself, there could be something medically wrong, but there's a good chance this is just my anxiety presenting. And it's this survival response ultimately that I'm going through. And it happens. As humans, we all go through this from time to time. It's most likely going to be temporary. Let me just kind of notice and observe this rather than getting so caught up in it. It's me recognizing like, I'm never not going to have anxiety. It's a part of life, and just realizing it doesn't have to become my whole identity. So just learning to be more observant and realize like this is a temporary thing. I'm going to get through this. This isn't the end of the world. This isn't as dangerous as it feels in the moment.
And I love that perspective of like being an observer of things rather than over investing in them. And I guess this sounds really abstract, but let me try to make it more concrete, right? So it's the difference between, like feeling and being really, really attached to something and thinking about it and overthinking it and it occupying every second of my mental space versus being able to say like, okay, I feel anxious. Where is that in my body? It's in my chest and it feels really tight. Okay, so let's not continue to think anxious things. Instead, let's just breathe and focus on breathing. So it's like we're being present with things, but we're not giving them all the weight. Does that make more? Is
yes. And we're not being hard on ourselves about them. We're not judging ourselves for experiencing these things. Yeah, we're just riding the wave of our anxiety. It will eventually fall.
Yes, because your body can only maintain high energy for so long too. So if that's any level of comfort as well, I mean, anxiety spirals can feel really intense, but they can be managed. And if it is getting to be too much, or if you're starting to feel like it's interfering with your life, definitely seek out professional assessment, evaluation, therapy, medication management, whatever feels right for you. Explore these options. Awareness, self-compassion can totally be key tools to managing anxiety over time. And this was just kind of a casual conversation between myself and Madison about anxiety, what it is, what the spiral is, definitely not therapy or counseling in any way. It's important to remember you're not alone. Resources are available. We really want to make sure that you're utilizing resources you can. Here at Victoria College, we have free counseling for all of our enrolled students. Please seek us out on our website, walk in, give us a call. So thank you for joining us today in your go-to space for honest conversations about mental health and well-being. We are your hosts, Brittany
and Madison,
and we are so glad that you spent part of your day with us. Remember, taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. Be kind to yourself, reach out if you need support, and know that you are never alone. Until next time, take care and take a deep